We all hate government overreach. Some of us really hate government overreach. But while we've all struggled with navigating the web of bureaucracy that is the local council, there is one level of government that you do not want to cross under any circumstances. A cabal that may work behind the scenes but is the exact opposite of shadowy. We all hate them, and they sure as hell hate you. But what happens if you decide that you don't want anything to do with the government anymore? What if you just decide that the whole social contract thing just isn't working out for you, so you decide to simply opt out of society? Well, the government will come at you with the fury of a million jealous ex-girlfriends and use things as minor as a small Venmo transfer, a spicy tweet, or a gun's barrel being just a touch too short as an excuse to absolutely destroy you. But the true danger of the alphabet agencies is their sheer incompetence. If a situation requires a scalpel, they will very happily bring a sledgehammer. If they decide that they don't like you, they are so petty, so power mad, and so mind-numbingly stupid that nothing will stop them from having their way with you. Not even innocence. Ruby Ridge. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, this video is sponsored by War Thunder. War Thunder is a free-to-play epic military action game featuring land, sea and air multiplayer combat available for PC, Xbox, PlayStation and Mac. Every battle in War Thunder is a tactical challenge and involves all kinds of vehicles from world-renowned models to prototypes, whether in the air, on the ground or at sea. In the last update, an entire family of unique ground vehicles from Hungary was added. Also, air battles have become much more immersive and atmospheric with the new voice warning system. Graphics have also been tweaked and improved with new visual effects that change dynamically based on lighting. War Thunder is at the forefront of truly capturing the scale and intensity of battles with stunning location detail, advanced effects and realistic sounds to make you feel like you are truly in the fight. The game offers a truly unique damage system. In War Thunder, you target individual vehicle modules and destroy them in order to take the enemy down. Targeting a fuel tank will cause a fire, or targeting an enemy's tank tracks will bring it to a standstill. War Thunder has vehicles from many eras, including from the early 20th century all the way up to the modern day, and each vehicle is crafted meticulously to match the real look and specification, including unique operation and movement. Vehicles can also have their modules upgraded to include smoke grenades, active protection systems, dynamic armour, and many more options. You can also give each vehicle a personal touch by customising its appearance. Each location has an immersive weather system that follows the laws of physics. Bombs leave deep craters in the earth which can tactically be used for cover. There are many different kinds of maps too, including desert, forest, snowy mountains and urban areas which are inspired by real locations. Due to the variety of vehicles and locations, no two battles will be the same. War Thunder is constantly updated, so there are always new things to do and new vehicles to try, so if anyone stopped playing in the past, you are sure to enjoy all the new additions. So, download War Thunder for free by clicking the link down in the description. All new players and those who haven't played War Thunder for half a year or more will receive some special bonuses, which include rentals for the P-40E1 aircraft and M4 tank for a whole week, along with free unique skins for both of them, a special decorator, Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, 3 premium vehicles for free, a week of premium and even more gifts. So hurry up, the American vehicle bonus season will end soon. Before we get started, I would just like to point out that this is a comedy video and all of its contents are jokes. The US government does nothing but protect our safety and best interests. I have the utmost faith in the honesty of the government. Fully semi-automatic assault rifles with high-capacity clipazines are weapons of war and should not be in the hands of civilians. The FBI and ATF do good and important work. I am of sound mind and body. I am happy. I currently have no health issues, and I have no intention to kill myself. So, with all of that out of the way, meet the Weaver family. The patriarch Randall had a very stereotypically American upbringing. He grew up in a farming community in Iowa, he played football in high school, and he spent 3 years in the army as a Green Beret. But everything changed during his military career when he met Vicky Jordison at Fort Bragg. Vicky's life up to this point was also incredibly ordinary. Like Randy, she grew up on a farm and she did well at school and then went on to work as a secretary. And she was very adept at pretty much every homemaking skill that you could imagine. The two were practically made for each other, and as if life were your standard rom-com, Randy spent every night he was on leave with Vicky, until they married in 1971 and moved to Cedar Falls, where Randy took a job at a tractor factory after leaving the army. After a period of domestic bliss, the couple's first child, Sarah, arrived in 1976. Sammy was born a couple of years later, and Rachel came along 4 years after him. Being Americans that grew up in a more civilized time, both Randy and Vicky had regularly attended church all their lives. But while Randy was the head of the family, the de facto spiritual centre of the family was really Vicky. Vicky was very, very religious and pushed the family towards the kind of Christianity that gets a lot of airtime on this channel. For some perspective, Vicky was so religious in that Old Testament way that she kept pork out of the house, took away the TV, and took it upon herself to go and live in the shed with her daughter whenever they were on their periods. I mean, trad wives are a bit of a meme at this point, but Vicky was trad. Like, very, very trad. And Randy just kinda went along with it. After all, trading bacon and TV for a week of peace and quiet every month, I mean, that's a pretty good deal. So yeah, the Weavers were a little bit kooky, but ultimately, they were rather wholesome. A nice, all-American family, right? Well, don't get too attached. As the 80s rolled around, Randy and Vicky found themselves getting increasingly blackpilled. The economy had taken a turn, farmers all around them were losing their land to soaring interest rates and gas prices, and the government was plunging into an absolute death spiral of corruption. Because time is a flat circle. Vicky, in particular, had always been quite the doomer, having had visions of the end of the world since 1978, but they were starting to feel increasingly prophetic. As I said before, Vicky always ran a very fundamentalist household, but she increasingly started to push the family towards becoming the great conflagration is coming levels of religious as time wore on. This mounting tension manifested in the family a desire to move to the mountains, not just to survive Judgment Day, but also to escape the sheer corruption of modern society. The main source of this corruption was the government, which the Weavers, quite rightly, believed was the embodiment of the beast that they and all other Christians would go to war against during Armageddon. This holy war would be the only project that the government has ever completed ahead of schedule. Now, I know that all of you fantasize all the time about living in a cabin in the woods, and most of you would probably be immediately eaten by bears or starved to death once the Mountain Dew and packs of ramen ran out, but Randy was a Green Beret. So he knew what he was doing and how to handle himself beyond the boundaries of civilization. The Weavers were very serious about taking the Ted pill, so they prepared extensively to ensure that they could do it properly. Vicky read up on survivalist techniques and learned how to be self-sufficient by developing skills such as canning her own food. And Randy prepared by collecting the most important of supplies that the family would need, most notably guns. Lots and lots of guns. Well, I say lots, but really it was just 14. But considering the type of Americans they were, that's still a very low amount. But none of the Weavers, even the kids, left the house unarmed. The family saw firearms just like any other tool around the house, to be used for hunting for food and protecting themselves from wild animals and members of the, and I swear to God, these are the Weavers' words, not mine, Zionist-occupied government. Eventually, the time came, and in 1983, the Weavers sold everything that they didn't need, packed up the truck, and left society behind. They shacked up together in northern Idaho, where they bought 20 acres on a mountaintop named Ruby Ridge for $5,000. For an idea of how remote this area is, the population density of the county is fewer than 7 people per square mile. They were also almost completely alone. The Weavers erected a sign at the entrance to the property that read, "Every knee shall bow to Yahshua Messiah." And before you all start making my lawyer very nervous in the comments, Yahshua is Hebrew for Jesus. The Weavers worked so hard to build a little house together, and their famous cabin was finished by March 1984. The Weaver home, which was described as a rustic log cabin, everyone's dream, consisted of a big living room with an open-plan kitchen and pantry on the main floor, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. To be perfectly honest, I cannot imagine a cosier place to live. Or die. And just an FYI for the 5 women in the audience, this is what men think about when we're not thinking about the Roman Empire. I've got the money, I've came this close so many times, but my wife won't let me. As if the cabin couldn't get even cosier, Vicky turned the homeliness up to 11 by making curtains and cushions by hand and staining the cabinet. However, due to being on a mountaintop in the middle of nowhere, the Weavers had no mains electricity or running water. So life at Ruby Ridge wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it was pretty hard work, but it was completely worth it. The family was fully participating in the power process, so just existing together as they were was enough to lead a wholesome, rewarding, and frankly, quite idyllic lifestyle. And the kids loved it too. When they weren't playing board games, picking berries, and making friends, they enthusiastically helped their parents grow their own food and hunt game in between homeschooling lessons from Vicky. They took full part in the running of their little slice of paradise and shared in all of its rewards, both nutritional and spiritual, instead of having their souls starved by surrogate activities in front of a screen. Yes, I understand the irony. Randy and Vicky were such great parents that in the mid-80s, they took in a troubled teenager named Kevin Harris, because God forbid we make a fatherlessness-free video, who the Weavers treated just like any other member of the family. While Ruby Ridge is very secluded, there is still something of a local community, which is largely made up of, let's just say, like-minded individuals. After all, you don't find yourself that far out unless you're actively trying to get away from modern society. Randy put his sense of community spirit to good use in 1988 by getting involved in local politics, where he proved to be rather spicy. He ran for sheriff and he promised to give everyone literal get-out-of-jail-free cards and only enforce the laws that the people in the area actually wanted. Absolutely based. Of the 486 votes that were cast in the election, Randy got 102, further proving that the best thing that any elected official can do is nothing. But yeah, the Weavers' neighbours were rather interesting, especially their most notable acquaintances who lived 16 miles away in a compound near Hayden Lake, and they were called The Aryan nations. I think you can all guess what they believed in. Despite those beliefs, the Weavers got rather friendly with their neighbours and attended a few of their events, such as picnics and the big annual extravaganza at their compound, which they called the World Aryan Congress. But despite having fraternised with the Aryan nations, I need to stress the fact that Randy never actually joined them. Randy Weaver was never a member of the Aryan nations. He and his family just hung out with them on social occasions. After all, when you're so far out in the sticks, beggars can't really be choosers when making friends. Randy also enjoyed a good debate, and he liked talking to people of all stripes, regardless of whether he agreed with them or not. And Randy did not agree with the Aryan nations. He was a bit more Scott Adams about their main point of policy, referring to himself as a white separatist rather than a supremacist. Still a controversial stance, I will admit, but at least he wasn't looking to devote himself full-time to the old racism like his neighbours. After all, Ruby Ridge was so remote that a distance of 16 miles was still close enough to call the Aryan nations neighbours. They weren't just trying to get away from minorities, they were trying to get away from everyone. Yes, Randy and Vicky could be a little bit schizo in their mindset, but at the end of the day, all they really wanted was to be left alone. But unfortunately, the side that wants to win will always beat the side that wants to be left alone. As you would expect, the feds had been investigating the Aryan nations for ages, and it shouldn't come as a surprise that they started sniffing around the Weavers in 1989. Their surveillance kicked off after a neighbour reported that Randy had allegedly threatened to kill Ronald Reagan and the governor of Idaho, which got Randy a visit from a Secret Service agent. Randy then denounced the allegation as a smear campaign and demanded an apology from the spook that paid him a visit. But let's be real, that visit wasn't really necessary. Who hasn't threatened to kill Ronald Reagan? At the 1989 World Aryan Congress, Randy first met Kenneth Fadley, who was there to write down the license plate numbers of everyone's cars, pretend to be a weapons dealer, and save the event's organisers an absolute mint on lighting. But that begs the question, why do the feds care so much about racists in rural Idaho? They're in rural Idaho. Who the fuck are they going to be racist to? Of course, Fadley targeted Randy and got to talking with him until he was comfortable enough to approach him with a job offer. Randy was struggling a little bit financially at the time because odd jobs weren't the easiest to come by. And Fadley used this to try and employ him as a supplier for his gun business. And by some crazy coincidence, sawed-off shotguns just so happened to be the most popular product. But sawn-off shotguns are very, very fucking illegal. So Fadley asked Randy to cut the barrels of a pair of legal shotguns down to 5 inches below the legal limit and then sell them to him. This is a trick that the police still do to this day. If they can't find anything to get you on, they will trick and manipulate you into committing a crime. And this went exactly as you would expect. Randy found himself facing federal charges by the ATF for possession and manufacture of illegal firearms on the 24th of October 1989, after selling 2 illegal sawed-off shotguns to an undercover ATF agent. This was blatant entrapment, absolute entrapment. Fadley had entrapped Randy, especially since it took some persuasion to actually convince Randy to do the job. And this is where things start to get pretty fucked up. The following June, the feds offered to drop the charges if Randy agreed to inform on the Aryan nations for them. Randy said no, made it clear that being a snitch was against his beliefs, and told the Aryan nations to keep an eye out for any incandescents within their ranks. Vicky appeared to share her husband's conviction, having written, "We cannot make deals with the enemy. If we are not free to obey the laws of Yahweh, we may as well be dead," in an open letter addressed to the Aryan nations and all our brethren of the Anglo-Saxon race. In the business, we call this foreshadowing, but after being told where they could shove their offer, the feds indicted Randy on the firearms charge on the 13th of December, 1990. The feds decided that they had to take an unorthodox approach to arresting Randy because they thought he was too dangerous to bring in properly. So, instead of treating him like a human being, they decided to do something that would be guaranteed to piss him off. Randy was out on a supply run with Vicky when they came across a pair of stranded motorists in the road. How original. The couple then stopped and approached to offer help like any good Christian would, and they were immediately jumped on by the feds, who arrested Randy and pushed Vicky face first into a snowbank. Despite having no criminal record, Randy was charged with a felony, arraigned without a lawyer, and he had to post his property as an unsecured bond to get out of jail the next day. To make matters even worse, the judge also told Randy that if he were convicted, he would have to pay back the government for his court-appointed lawyer. The judge was actually mistaken, and this wasn't the case at all. But being told this dramatically escalated the impact of the charges on Randy, because such a reimbursement would actually cost him and his family their home. Randy and Vicky sat the kids down and discussed the situation as a family. Of course, no one wanted to lose their home or see Randy in jail, but they didn't know what to do about the situation. In the end, they decided to just wait and see what happened, hoping that someone would come along and get everything sorted reasonably and apologise to Randy for his treatment thus far. According to Sarah, Randy said that if the sheriff would come up and knock on my door, I'd invite him in for coffee, and we'd sit down and have a discussion. After posting bail, Randy's hearing was scheduled for February 1991, and he failed to show up. He claimed that some clerk had actually fucked up because the summons he received had the 20th of March on it, further suggesting that he had been set up. But let's be real, Randy was never going to show up anyway. Though he wasn't so much digging in and saying, "come and get me," as doing a little bit of civil disobedience. But clerical error or not, another arrest warrant was issued, and Randy was indicted for failing to appear at court. Unable to catch a break, the Weavers only got more obstinate as the entire family refused to leave the mountain, now convinced that Randy would face nothing but persecution if he were to give himself up. Federal marshals then spent the next few months trying to figure out how to bring Randy in, which wasn't made easy by the constant presence of the kids and the fact that the entire family were armed to the fucking teeth. After all, they lived in rural America. Weapons were part of their religion. It also didn't help that the marshals asked the Weavers' neighbours for advice on how to approach Randy, and all they got as an answer was, "lol, LMAO." As the marshals tried to come up with a game plan, ideas that were floated included dismissing the charges to get Randy to come out and put his guard down, and then immediately refile the charges and arrest him. Or looking at the cabin and saying, "never mind manoeuvres, go straight at them." The marshals also asked the ATF for some advice on how to handle the situation, and they were told, "he believes that this charge by the government against him is the beginning of Armageddon. The end of the world is coming, and he is ready to make his stand in the final battle. I would urge utmost caution." The ATF, of course, just a few years later, would become experts in massacring religious people that just wanted to be left alone. But more on that later in the video. Hearing that would make anyone nervous, but the question of how to get Randy in safely was really not helped by Vicky, who was a bit too much of a base trad wife. She just couldn't stop sending threatening letters to federal agencies, saying shit like, the tyrant's blood will flow, and whether we live or whether we die, we will not bow to your evil commandments. She also wrote to US Attorney Maurice O. Ellsworth and called him a servant of the Queen of Babylon. Right-wing woman moments they're just something else. Over the next few months, the US Marshals tried to negotiate for Randy's compliance by post, but life went on more or less as normal at Ruby Ridge. The Weavers went about their daily business, and friends of the family were kind enough to regularly deliver supplies. After all, self-imposed house arrest isn't really that much of a problem when you've got a 20-acre garden. During this period, Vicky gave birth to a daughter in the shed where she spent her periods, with Randy playing midwife by helping to deliver baby Elisheba. After the new arrival, the shed was henceforth called the birthing shed. Despite life going on relatively normally, it was not without incident. In March of 1992, some plainclothes US Marshals drove up the road to the cabin, but Randy saw them off at gunpoint for trespassing. While Randy was well within his rights to do so, the Marshals weren't too pleased about this, and in the end, they decided that Randy would never go quietly. They just completely gave up on trying to come up with a peaceful resolution to take Randy in. So they decided to do it by force. The Special Operations Group set up a command post near the property, set up video surveillance around the place, began the stakeout, and got to work on planning an ambush. The Marshals came up with a number of potential schemes to get Randy out of hiding, with the main contender involving setting up a pair of undercover deputies nearby as new neighbours to infiltrate the family. However, the intelligence gathering stage of the operation never progressed to that point. Other ideas that were floated included using rubber bullets in an assault on the cabin, and charting the 16-year-old Sarah's menstrual cycle so that they could kidnap her while she was in the birthing shed. I'm not going to lie, I think someone should check the hard drives of the guy that came up with that idea. During this stage of the planning, the media had caught on to the story and started to portray Randy as a folk hero that was sticking it to the man to protect his family. So the Marshals felt a mounting pressure to bring an end to the stalemate because it was starting to become really embarrassing for them. But after 16 months, the Marshals wouldn't be twiddling their thumbs for much longer. They were going to twiddle their trigger fingers instead. The 21st of August 1992 started just like any other day, with Vicky notably being seen out and about in this now infamous photograph that was snapped by the US Marshals. Also seen pottering around the property were Sarah, Sammy and Kevin, who were all strapped as always. But what they didn't know was that a paramilitary unit of half a dozen US Marshals were out scouting the woods on their property to plan an ambush, which came much quicker than anyone expected. You see, the family dog Striker had sensed the Marshals and started to kick up a fuss. So Randy, Kevin and Sammy went out with him to investigate, hoping that he had noticed a deer. However, what they didn't know was that they had just run into US Marshals, who handled the situation like consummate professionals with perfect execution, 100% by the book. It's just a shame it was the ATF book. After Striker blew their cover, the Marshals claimed to have identified themselves right away, but all Randy heard was someone yelling, "Freeze Randy," to which Randy replied, "Fuck you," and he headed back to the cabin. The Marshals then passed the Kingsman exam with flying colours and all hell broke loose because you know what happens, there's a dog involved, there's cops involved, they shot the dog, right, of course they shot the fucking dog. Sammy then reacted with a cry of, "You shot Striker, you son of a bitch." A Marshal then pointed his rifle, and Sammy opened fire to defend himself. Hearing the firefight kicking off in the distance, Randy fired his shotgun in the air, ordered Sammy to come home, and he heard a shout of, "I'm coming, Dad," in response. As Sammy ran, Kevin provided covering fire from behind a stump, shooting and killing a marshal named William F. Deegan. How awful, but despite Kevin's attempts to cover Sammy's retreat, the 14-year-old boy was shot twice in the back, killed by a round that hit his heart. A lot of arguing has gone back and forth since that day over who shot first, with the government claiming that Sammy and Kevin started it. But from what I've told you so far and how the rest of this story plays out, you will see that there is basically no reason whatsoever to believe the government's account. Back at the cabin, Sammy's death had obviously left the Weavers absolutely grief-stricken, prompting Randy to fire his gun into the sky. Because American. Half a mile away, the marshals could hear cries of Yahweh from Vicky, and of course the Chinese whispers that made their way back to Washington said that a federal marshal had been murdered and that armed fanatics had pinned the others down with continued fire. That night, the FBI arrived on the scene, and despite investigation literally being in their name, they had no idea what the fuck was going on. They thought that they were responding to an unprovoked attack on the US Marshals, and they responded accordingly. Over 100 goons swarmed onto the mountain in armoured personnel carriers and helicopters. They set up a perimeter of snipers and set up roadblocks around the property. The next day, the mountaintop was also flooded by TV crews and hundreds of spectators, many of whom were protesters decrying what the feds were doing. While hundreds watched the siege from the scene, millions more watched on the TV or kept up with the siege in the papers, receiving regular updates as things rapidly escalated. Randy ignored all of the feds' attempts at negotiation. Because, of course he did. He wasn't taking their shit before, so why the fuck would he now after they murdered his son? Even when the feds brought out Randy's sister to bat for them, Randy refused to take the bait. When you live in a cabin in the woods, siblings really aren't loyal, are they? The feds were so woefully misinformed about the whole situation that they had it in their heads that the Weavers were extremely dangerous from their position in what they thought was a heavily fortified cabin in a mountain stronghold with a massive arsenal. So, the snipers were ordered to shoot to kill any armed adults on sight. In reality, however, the Weavers were sitting in a plywood shack with a few .22s, a shotgun, and a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. They were well armed, to be sure, but they were more equipped for hunting and personal protection rather than watering the Tree of Liberty. But when have the feds ever given a shit about that? Randy, Kevin, and Sarah went out to the birthing shed where they had moved Sammy's body. A sniper on the ironically named hostage rescue team named Lon Horiuchi spotted them. He decided that the morning party were out to shoot at a helicopter, so he aimed a kill shot at Randy's back. Luckily, however, Randy moved to open the shed door at the last second, so he was only hit in the right arm. Everyone then hauled arse back to the cabin for safety, as Vicky was standing behind the doorway holding Elishiba. And Horiuchi shot her. He claimed that he didn't see her and was actually aiming for Kevin, so he somehow managed to pull off a perfect headshot by accident. The .308 round went straight through Vicky's head before going through Kevin's left arm and lodging in his chest as he ran into the cabin. Thankfully, the baby Elishiba was unhurt. The whole, "oh, I didn't see her, I just so happened to pull off a perfect headshot after I was given specific orders to shoot every adult" is the biggest steaming pile of bullshit I have ever heard a Fed say. And those guys are the kings of bullshit. But do not worry, we will arrive back at this absolutely bogus excuse later, but right now, I want to really hammer this point home. The police blew an unarmed woman's head off while she was holding a baby. And To this day, the feds still believe that they were completely justified in doing so. Well, I think we would be completely justified every single one of them. How about that? And the day's coming. From that point onwards, Randy, his surviving daughters, and Kevin holed up inside the cabin. They blacked out the windows and refused to budge. Meanwhile, the feds started destroying outbuildings around the cabin, and they found Sammy's body the next day. They also sent out a robot to take a phone to the cabin, but it was soon sent back after Randy threatened to shoot it. The situation was so dire that Randy's refusal to be taken alive went from being a mere assumption by the feds to something that he was outright stating. And who could blame him? Everything that he and Vicky believed about the government and the end of the world was coming true before his very eyes. And he wasn't the only one. Things got a little bit spicy among the protesters, especially after they found out that Sammy had been killed. They were fucking furious. Several protesters started openly wishing for the deaths of more feds. Someone, probably kids, even attached a hand-painted sign to an ATF caravan behind the roadblock that read, "Thank you for keeping North Idaho a safe place to grow up." But one little thing that the cops were not aware of is the cops didn't know that they had killed Vicky. They heard the shot ring out, and then they heard about 30 seconds of constant screaming coming from inside the cabin. They thought that everyone was just panicking at being shot at. No, they were all screaming and crying because they just saw their mother's head get blown off right in front of them. And this got even worse when on the 24th of August, a negotiator who was still unaware that Vicky was dead, unwittingly poured salt in the wound by calling out to try and appeal to her by saying, "Good morning, Mrs. Weaver. We had pancakes this morning. And what did you have for breakfast? Why don't you send the children out for some pancakes, Mrs. Weaver?" Naturally, the family saw this attempt to get the kids out as a sick fucking joke and refused to take the bait. Some of the protesters were far less equipped in the restraint department, however. The next day, 5 neo-Nazi skinheads were arrested after being stopped on a back road near the cabin with a jeep full of guns and ammo. Now, that was a really fucking stupid thing to do, and that didn't help anyone at all. The optics of it were so bad that Randy's supporters over at the protest wished that the skinheads hadn't bothered to offer their support at all, saying, "Randy Weaver might be a racist, but this isn't about racism, and these guys want you to think it is." Even without the skinheads being absolute muppets, the protesters knew that they were fighting an uphill battle, and not just because they were on a mountain. Look at pretty much any right-wing protest movement. No matter how peaceful they are always either shut down with extreme prejudice or allowed to continue because they're either a psyop, containment, a glowing honeypot, fuel for a media smear campaign, or all of the above. In a day and age where protests against the government have to be greenlit by the government, pretty much any kind of organisation is controlled opposition or containment in some way. Other than offering the Weavers moral support, the protesters at the foot of the mountain were achieving nothing. After several days of the FBI negotiators getting absolutely nowhere, a Special Forces soldier named Bo Gritz stepped in on the 28th of August. Gritz was a prominent right-wing figure who hosted a radio show that the Weavers listened to. And he put his facts and logic to good use when he was driven to a safe distance from the cabin in an armoured vehicle and given a bullhorn so he could talk to Randy. It didn't go too well. An hour later, Bo returned to the Fed's base, shaking his head and saying, "Boy, you guys really screwed that one up." Then he told them about the state of Randy and Kevin's injuries and Vicky's death, saying, "You damn near killed the whole family." This dressing down was particularly rough for the negotiators because they had spent almost a week specifically trying to talk to Vicky with no idea that she was dead the entire time. By the 30th of August, Kevin was critically injured. He was having trouble breathing and coughing up blood. And he was even begging Randy and Sarah to finish him off. With Randy's surrogate son in desperate need of aid, Grits managed to talk him into giving Kevin up so he could receive medical attention. And he also negotiated the removal of Vicky's body from the cabin, which he carried out himself with the help of a family friend. However, he couldn't quite convince Randy or his daughters to come out. Though the girls did let their beloved pet parakeets go with the family friend for their own safety. Despite this promising step, feds still got fed, so the commander of the hostage rescue team told Grits, "Bo, if you don't get them out by noon tomorrow, we're taking them out." Serve and protect my fucking arse. And with that, the 11-day standoff ended on the 31st of August. As the feds were fixing to put an end to the siege once and for all, Grits decided to beat them to the cabin in a last-ditch effort to avoid any more bloodshed, offering Randy the services of a famous star lawyer named Jerry Spence once the dust had settled. However, Randy resisted his appeal to give up because, as they did a year and a half prior, the Weaver family voted and decided to stay put no matter what. To this, Grits responded, "Weaver, damn you. Don't tell me that we are not going to continue when I have carried your bride out of this cabin, when we've got out Kevin Harris, who is still alive. Don't tell me you're going to quit now." After making it clear that it was now or never, Grits finally managed to get through to Randy, and despite how terrified the girls were of being shot the moment they set foot out of the cabin, Randy decided that it was finally time to leave. At long last, Grits managed to escort Randy and his daughters out of the cabin and down the mountain. And do you want to know how he managed that? An actual human being fucking talked to Randy and treated him with respect and compassion. All they had to do all along was talk him down. They didn't have to set up an ambush and instantly kill the dog, they didn't have to go in guns blazing, and they didn't have to murder his son or blow his wife's head off while she was holding their baby. All they had to do was fucking sit down and talk. "Oh, but Dankula, he said you'll never take me alive." Yeah, well, they all fucking say that. Until you convince them otherwise. I think it's fair to say that Bo Grits saved all of their lives. You may wonder why Randy didn't give himself up sooner just to make sure that his daughters could get to safety, and that is a fair thing to ask. But the feds had besieged his home, shot first, and killed his wife and son in cold blood. He had no reason at all to believe that the feds were going to stop there. You can't blame Randy for being convinced that he and his family were going to get marstoned if he gave up. They had been out to get him long before those 6 marshals set foot on his property. But in the end, Randy was arrested, and his daughters went to live with their maternal grandparents back in Iowa. After 8 months in jail, Randy and Kevin's trial started on the 14th of April 1993. The pair were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and the prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, even though Kevin acted in self-defense and Randy wasn't even part of the initial shootout that saw a marshal die. And none of the Weavers even fired a single shot at anyone after they had retreated into the cabin. But Randy and Kevin were in good hands as Jerry Spence kept his promise and represented Randy alongside Kevin's court-appointed lawyer, David Nevin. The prosecution kept it simple and stuck to the tried and true method of calling their opponents racist. Been there. To them, Randy's anti-government beliefs, his politics, and his stubbornness forced the marshal's hands, making the deaths of his wife, his son, and the Marshal Deegan Randy's fault. The prosecution also used Vicky's threatening letters as evidence that the siege was the Weavers' fault. Meanwhile, the defence opened strongly. Nevin declared his intent to save Kevin from being the fall guy for how the government handled the siege. In the opening arguments, they were quick to point out that Sammy's last words before being shot in the back were, "I'm coming, Dad," showing that he was clearly retreating and was no longer a threat to the marshals that had killed him. To hammer that argument home, Nevin really wanted to put Kevin on the stand because the jury would be sure to see him as a good kid who didn't want to kill Deegan. And sure, Kevin's story was easily believable and may have even come across very well to the jury, but Spence advised against it, because if they played that game, then the case would all come down to which side spun the best yarn rather than the facts themselves. There was also another problem with the defence presenting witnesses. Randy was such a stubborn and angry hard arse that God only knows what the fuck would have come out of his mouth if he set foot on the stand. Randy was such a liability that Spence decided not to present any witnesses at all because Randy couldn't be trusted. They were thinking that he was just going to fed post throughout the entire trial, and see, to be honest, who could fucking blame him? Spence also considered putting up Sarah, but he decided against it because since the prosecution's main strategy was to paint the Weavers as racist, he was worried that Sarah would be, let's just say, a bit too honest during cross-examination. While Spence's decision to not present any witnesses sounds like he was kneecapping his own case, he had a solid plan. Spence's strategy involved focusing on the God-given, quintessentially American rights to freedom of religion and self-defense. So he was thrilled about the prosecution's opening argument because they hinged their case on exactly what he wanted: the beliefs of the Weavers. For example, Spence countered the argument about Vicky's spicy letters by citing the First Amendment to point out their irrelevance, asking the prosecutor, "I, as a citizen of the United States, have a right to call you the Queen of Babylon if I want to." True? Spence set out to dismantle the prosecution's case on cross-examination by using their own witnesses against them. This angle of attack was twofold. One, he and his team would shoot as many holes in the prosecution's case as possible, expose all of the misconduct and incompetence that they could find, and two, provide the jury with that crucial reasonable doubt 12 Angry Men style. And it fucking worked. For example, on the question of who shot first, one of the marshals that started the siege admitted that the first shot he heard sounded like a 223, which was used by the marshal that shot Stryker. Another prosecution witness, a family friend who was put on the stand to testify about the Weavers' unwavering fighting spirit against the government, told Spence all about how unbearably afraid Vicky was of the government taking her kids and putting them into the notoriously awful care system, and about how loving Randy and Vicky's relationship was. The defence also put the FBI's rules of engagement under scrutiny, bringing up the fact that there was no ongoing firefight when the hostage rescue team showed up, and that the plans of attack were drawn up by the idiots in Washington before any of them were even briefed on the situation by those on the ground. Technically, this wasn't incorrect because federal law does supersede state law, as the hostage rescue team's commander stated during the trial, but the way he stated it just really rubbed the jury the wrong way. When Horiuchi took to the stand, he continued to claim that he didn't see Vicky behind the door before blowing her brains out. But he admitted that he knew that it was possible for someone to be standing there. Being a sniper trained specifically for hostage situations, you would think that Horiuchi would be incredibly aware of what's behind his target at all times before he fires. But, well, fed. To really rub Horiuchi's face in how badly he had fucked up, Spence asked for 30 seconds of silence so that the jury could really imagine the screaming that was heard in the half minute of horror after he fired. Good start, but the real shitstorm came for the prosecution after the day's proceedings came to an end. The US attorney leading the prosecution, Ron Howen, had a rather interesting package waiting for him in his office. A picture that Horiuchi himself drew the day after the siege. This is what he saw the moment before he pulled the trigger. See those two semicircles at the bottom of the door window? Those are heads. Those are fucking heads. He did see Vicky. He did see Vicky behind the door, and he fucking knew it was her. Horiuchi ended up having to fly back to Idaho to explain himself to the jury, who he outright fucking lied to under oath. And the special delivery was described as the low point of Howen's career. But as humiliating as it was, at least he didn't muzzle sweep an entire jury with his finger on the trigger. Another funny thing that happened during the trial occurred on day 4. The feds torched the Branch Davidians, and the jury was told, nothing to see here, just ignore that, but as dark as it is, I imagine that this was a bit of a blessing in disguise for the defence. Because even if the defence are told that they are not allowed to say something to the jury, the common tactic is to say it anyway, and then retract it when the judge complains. So, your comment is now stricken from the court record, but the jury still heard it. And now you've got their noggins jogging. And while a judge can tell a jury not to take certain things into consideration, one can't just unthink a thought. After 36 days of listening to a load of ballistic and forensic experts and the defence building a Weaver family fan club out of the prosecution's 54 witnesses, it would have been the defence's turn to make its case on the 15th of June. But since the defence decided to skip that stage, it was now time for the closing arguments. The prosecution once again insisted that the government did everything possible to resolve things peacefully, and that Randy and Kevin's stubbornness put everyone involved at risk and got Vicky, Sammy and Deegan killed. Victim blaming, essentially. Nevin simply reiterated that the government's account of what happened was untrue, and he decried the charges against Kevin as preposterous. Spence, however, did not keep it simple. He started off by calling the jury the most important in a decade and said that this case will be read about by law students for decades to come. Or discussed by libertarians on YouTube. He then approached Randy and said to him, Randy, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. You're guilty of being one stubborn mother. You are guilty of being afraid. Then he said to the jury, aren't we all guilty of being afraid? And then he spent the next 2.5 hours denouncing the government's attempt to sweep its own fuck up under the rug. He declared that the trial was in fact a murder case, but, and I quote, the people who committed the murder have not been charged, before finishing off by saying that Randy had been punished enough and appealing to the jury to end this horror once and for all. On the 8th of July 1993, after the longest period of jury deliberations in Idaho's history, Randy was acquitted of everything, except for failure to appear in court, for which he was sentenced to 18 months in prison and a $10,000 fine. The ATF's firearms charges were found to be the result of entrapment, because they blatantly fucking were. And they were therefore thrown out because the agent had solicited the criminal activity instead of Randy taking any initiative to engage in criminal behaviour. You all knew that already, but it's nice to take small victories in the courts where we can. The verdict also came with a number of red pills, with one juror saying that an incredible injustice has been done. The farther we got along in the case, the more I thought, this is ridiculous, the wrong people are on trial. Regarding the firearms charge that started the entire mess, the jury foreman said, I don't much like Weaver, his white supremacist buddies, or their views. But it is beginning to look to me a lot like much of what has happened cannot be laid at his feet. With his sentence handed down, Randy was locked up on the 18th of October 1993. Thanks to the time that he had already served while awaiting his sentence, he was out by Christmas, leaving prison on the 17th of December. Kevin, meanwhile, got off completely scot-free for having done nothing wrong and acting in self-defence. The Weavers filed wrongful death suits to the tune of $300 million, though it ended in a settlement in 1995. The kids were awarded $1 million each, and Randy received $100,000, though a Department of Justice official said that he probably would have gotten $200 million if the case had gone to trial. Kevin also sued the government for $10 million and settled for $380,000. In the autumn of 1995, a Senate Judiciary Committee launched an investigation in which Randy and Kevin testified, and the report was actually quite scathing, saying that every agency involved with the Weaver case was careless at some level in the way it handled information. The investigation revealed that the feds had operated under the assumption that Randy was much more dangerous than he actually was, which was why they all but literally went scorched earth. As the FBI director Louis Freeh put it, one misstatement of fact exaggerated to another one into a huge pile of information that was just dead wrong. The committee concluded that the blame for everything that happened lay at the feds' feet, saying that, and I quote, "Federal law enforcement professionals are held to a higher standard than ordinary American citizens, and this country can tolerate mistakes made by people like Randy Weaver, but we cannot accept serious errors made by federal law enforcement agencies that needlessly result in human tragedy." In the aftermath of the investigation, 12 feds were disciplined and 4 high-ranking officials were suspended. That was it. That was it. No one went to jail. No one even got fucking fired. They all got away with it. They all pretty much completely got away with it. They got a little slap in the wrist from their boss, and that was it. They all just went back to being feds. Full pay, full pensions, the lot. None of them ever saw the inside of a prison cell. Also, the Deputy Director of the FBI, Larry A. Potts, was demoted, but not before FBI officials flew to Washington for his going away party, and they claimed it on expenses as an official trip, for which they got nothing more than a letter in their file for inattention to detail. However, while he had been vindicated for a second time, it seemed to be a Pyrrhic victory for Randy, who testified, "If I had to do it over again, I would have come down the mountain for my court appearance." He also criticised the government for the complete lack of justice regarding Vicky's murder. The US Marshal Service not only got off completely scot-free, but the 6 marshals that blew the powder keg by killing Sammy and Stryker were actually awarded with the highest commendations. Government is a fucking joke. Despite having admitted that they royally fucked up the siege, the government didn't admit to having done anything wrong to Kevin, and they still ultimately blamed Randy for everything going south, saying that he, and I quote, "must bear a great deal of the blame for the bloodshed." Oh yeah, he missed a court date, so you tried to exterminate him and his family. Yeah, I can totally see how that tracks. There was also a Fed named E. Michael Cahill who tried to cover up everything by destroying a document that condemned the FBI's conduct during the siege. He pled guilty to obstruction of justice and was sentenced to 18 months in prison and a $4,000 fine. But they made sure to hold off on prosecuting him until he turned 50 so he could still get his retirement pension. He was the only guy that went to jail, not the guys that literally murdered a boy and blew a woman's head off while she was holding a baby, but this guy who destroyed a document. The only one that went to prison. The only one that actually saw any kind of serious repercussions. But he still got his fucking pension though, didn't he? With all of the tragedy and legal proceedings behind them, the Weavers moved to northwestern Montana in 1996. The family still owns Ruby Ridge, though their little house there is now gone. All that's left is the foundations. But while their part in the story was over, there was someone else who still needed to be dragged a little bit further across the coals. The Department of Justice took issue with Horiuchi's conduct at Ruby Ridge. Orders to shoot on sight without a chance to surrender was unconstitutional. He was wrong to kill Vicky because Randy and Kevin were retreating and therefore not an active threat. And aiming for the door without knowing who was behind it put Vicky and the children at risk. Another rule of engagement that the feds violated was end of the laneway, don't come up to the property. But I digress. Horiuchi was charged with involuntary manslaughter in 1997, but the charges were dropped. Not because of any lack of evidence, but because the judge decided that feds couldn't be charged for crimes they committed in the line of duty. Couldn't be charged for crimes they committed in the line of duty. An actual thing a judge said. An absolutely fucking terrifying thing a judge said. Even if he really was aiming for Kevin, the fact that he accidentally blew a housewife's brains out while she was holding a baby, despite seemingly being qualified enough to be on a fucking hostage rescue team, is bad enough to at least disgracefully end his career. The Solicitor General then had the fucking gall to say that federal law enforcement agents are privileged to do what would otherwise be unlawful if done by a private citizen. Apparently, that also includes doming a woman who was holding a fucking baby. Proving that there is no act of savage depravity that the government will not write off as a whoopsie, I'm such a Gemini, and then declare a complete lack of wrongdoing. In 2001, this ruling was overturned by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which made it possible for the book to be thrown at Horiuchi. But no one did. The prosecutor decided not to bring any charges against Horiuchi because, as he put it was time to move on. Imagine that. Can you fucking imagine that? Oh, this guy murdered 10 children 20 years ago? Well, it's time to move on. Horiuchi completely got away with it. Well, legally, at least. Someone that some of you may have heard of, a man called Timothy McVeigh, did send Horiuchi a lot of threatening letters that would have made Vicky proud. And he also handed out cards at gun shows with Horiuchi's name and address for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Due to his conviction for failing to appear at trial, Randy was no longer able to own firearms, but he was still a mainstay at local gun shows where he sold a book that he and Sarah wrote about the ordeal in 1998, and the book was titled The Federal Siege at Ruby Ridge. He and the rest of the family ultimately lived relatively normal lives, though for a long time the family's religious faith seemed to die with Vicky, as Randy completely abandoned it, having told a fan at a gun show, religion's all a bunch of crap. Sarah, however, became a born-again Christian in 2012, and while Randy very understandably never forgave the government for what happened at Ruby Ridge, she ultimately did. Eventually, Sarah announced in a Facebook post that Randy Weaver had passed away on the 11th of May 2022 at the age of 74. But what about the feds? Did they learn their lesson, or did Vicky and Sammy die for nothing? Well, yes and no. As I mentioned earlier, the feds took no notes from the immediate aftermath of Ruby Ridge and did a little bit of tomfoolery at a place called Waco the following year. For the two of you who don't know what that is, well, let's just say that Lon Horiuchi was also involved in that. Don't worry, it's on the list. Because of the sheer amount of lying about Waco, a lot of people started to question whether the feds' account of the Ruby Ridge story was actually true, and whether the government was actually even capable of holding its own goons accountable. Probably not, because we are still waiting for them to do so. Initially, it appeared to the general public that the feds hadn't actually done anything wrong, because the extent of their fuck-up didn't become clear until the investigation afterwards. As one historian put it, it was very easy to think, fucking white supremacist sends his kids out to shoot at the federal government, he gets what he deserves. Until everything actually came to light. The feds then praised themselves for having brought in a bunch of dangerous racists, and the New York Times called the Weavers an armed separatist brigade. Because journalists. To this day, Ruby Ridge is still spun as a cautionary tale about the apparent prevalence of right-wing extremism, even after the media acknowledged the government's role in what went on. They are still eager to miss the point entirely and denounce Randy, with one reporter saying that his legacy was, and I quote, one of a racist. Even though he called himself a white separatist, he's also an example of government overreach. Journalists they just can't fucking help themselves, can they? However, despite journalists running interference for the feds, their conduct at Ruby Ridge opened Pandora's asset forfeiture vault as many people woke up to the fact that the government is unequivocally the enemy of the people and will freely and happily commit war crimes against its own citizens, brag about it afterwards, and then face little to zero accountability. It was abundantly clear to the entire world that the feds didn't like Randy, so they illegally set him up with bullshit charges based on a technicality to force him into becoming a pawn. And when he refused, they were so eager to spring their trap and bury him that they put his wife and son in the ground instead. And then they fucking bragged about it. But do you want to know something extremely fucking funny? I mean, it's extremely sad, but it's also extremely fucking funny. Seriously, to me, this is the most nuclear part of this entire story. All of the government's persecution of Randy began because he refused to inform on the Aryan nations for the ATF. But who were the Aryan nations really? Well, it turned out they were just like any other hate group. Full of fucking feds. I mean, seriously, they had so many feds in there. The Aryan nations had been so thoroughly infiltrated by informants tied to several different federal agencies that the government was basically trying to get Randy to spy on the government. And not only that, but the informants glowed so hard that the Aryan nations actually knew all about them and even welcomed them. As their former head of security, John Bangerter, explained, "We were infiltrated. We knew it, and we always used that to our advantage. It was normal to have to deal with that. We didn't stop talking to them. We talked to them more to try and feed them as much disinformation as we could. Plus, we kept them close for the money. We always got money from them. They paid for everything. They handed out stacks of money like it was paper." Well, it was paper. But there you go, boys. Your tax dollars hard at work fighting the Nazis by funding the Nazis. Let all of that marinate for a moment. I mean, undercover informants who are full members of the group will be able to give you a lot more information than a guy who just attended some barbecues with the group. But the fact of the matter here is that feds tried to exterminate a family because the father wouldn't inform on a group that was full of feds. If the results weren't so fucking tragic, that would be the dumbest and funniest thing I have ever heard. This happens a lot, by the way. Three-letter agencies back in the day especially would not coordinate their undercover operations. So some group would catch the attention of all of the agencies, who would all then separately send in their own guys to work their way up to leadership positions, not realising that most of the high table is now made up of their own colleagues. The ATF actually wanted Randy as an informant because Fadley, their guy who had originally entrapped Randy in the first place, had his own cover blown by a fucking FBI informant trying to infiltrate the same group. So the ATF informant had his cover blown by the FBI informant because they had no idea they were both trying to get into the same group. This is really common, by the way. There are full videos online of drug busts gone wrong where the dealers try to arrest the buyers and vice versa, and it turns into this giant melee of, "You're under arrest, no, you're under arrest," and then all these cops are in this motel room beating the fuck out of each other, trying to arrest everyone because none of them had any idea about each other's operations, and it takes them way too long to realise that every single person in this room is a fucking cop. And these idiots, these morons, these absolute chucklefucks are the people in charge of your safety. It doesn't matter what you think of Randy, his views, his lifestyle, or how he conducted himself with the feds. You could think that he was a filthy, racist, uncivilized, Bible-thumping barbarian all you want. The man was certainly as imperfect as anyone else, but no one deserves that. No one. Yeah, his obstinacy made him very difficult to deal with, but their response was atrocious. As Randy said himself, "My wrongs did not cause federal agents to commit crimes. Nothing I did caused federal agents to violate the Constitution of the United States. I did not cause federal agents to violate the oath of their office. My actions did not cause federal agents to violate direct orders from Washington. My choices did not cause federal agents to violate state and federal law. My behaviour did not cause federal agents to violate their own agency policies. Federal agents have admitted to illegal acts." Even left-wing organisations couldn't deny just how seriously the feds had fucked up. Though I'm sure that wouldn't stop the ADL from trying. Further fueling the outrage was the fact that the siege came at a time where the ATF was getting increasingly hands-on in its operations, such as knocking people's front doors down at 5 in the morning and raiding local gun shops while holding the customers at gunpoint. Preppers, doomers, militias and boogaloo boys all across the United States suddenly saw their darkest fears come true before their eyes. Many were convinced that the government was going to strip away their Second Amendment rights and leave them impotent against the tyranny that always follows. And, as what happened to the Weavers made clear, the government was more than happy to stamp out any non-conformity by force. And Waco only made it worse because it established a pattern. If you don't toe the uniparty line, then at any moment the spooks will come in and fucking murder you and your family. As one historian put it, and I quote, "There was a perception that this style of violent policing had been unleashed, and particularly for people who had been involved in the gun rights movement, was being targeted particularly at people like them." Waco and Ruby Ridge became pretty much symbols of what could happen to anybody. As you would expect, this outrage fueled the mainstream media's fear of the spooky far right for years to come, with the Southern Poverty Law Centre calling Ruby Ridge the beginning of the modern militia movement. Oh, those spooky right-wingers, living way out in the middle of nowhere, minding their own business and growing vegetables, woo! However, this momentum and membership would be all but snuffed out very quickly, because Ruby Ridge and Waco also motivated the Oklahoma City bombing in April of 1995. Because it turns out that feds just massacring everyone who stands against them isn't conducive to making people not hate them. In response to the Oklahoma City bombing, Sarah Weaver reacted with horror, saying, and I quote, "It killed me inside. I knew what it was like to lose a family member in violence. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." Randy, however, clearly had no forgiveness for what had happened to him, because when he was asked how he felt about Timothy McVeigh's execution, he said there should be a bunch of federal agents lying right beside him on the gurney. He also said that McVeigh was going to be judge, jury and executioner, no different from the federal government. One has a badge and one don't. That said, however, Randy did not condone the bombing that was done in his name, saying that he would have told McVeigh to forget it if he had told him about his plans. Regarding McVeigh's execution, the Washington Post reported that, and I quote, "Randy Weaver says that the real enemy will remain at large. The real enemy will continue to violate the Constitution and eavesdrop on your house from a mile away with that super ear thing." And he wasn't really wrong. But as the dust settled on that shit show, the feds did start to calm down a little bit. But just to avoid public backlash, because the bombing gave Ruby Ridge and Waco a second wind in the media, as well as a surge of public sympathy. Additionally, the feds didn't want to make any more martyrs like they did with the Weaver family. So they didn't want to stop people from dying, they just wanted to stop people dying loudly. A new policy of just waiting out difficult characters for as long as it takes was implemented and used to great effect in 1996. A militia group called the Montana Freemen had their ranch foreclosed on and the feds came to evict them, initiating a standoff that lasted for 81 days, which was 29 days longer than Waco and 70 days longer than Ruby Ridge. But despite the protracted arrest attempt, no one got hurt at all. It helped that other militia groups had some pretty spicy ideas about what would happen should any of the Montana Freemen come to harm, but hey, at least the feds learned something. However, I can't be particularly optimistic. I don't really see this as the feds deciding to be more humane, because nowadays they're just simply employing different means to destroy anyone that they don't like. After all, look at the recent wave of frozen bank accounts, coordinated media smear jobs, deplatforming, imprisonment for shaking fences and then calmly walking into a building, talking about other people walking into a building, asking the wrong questions, or just good old-fashioned suicides. If you don't toe the party line, it doesn't matter how far you run, how far off the grid you get, or how much you detach yourself from civilization, the feds are as petty as they are powerful, and they will stop at nothing to fucking get you. Now, a bunch of people are probably going to do the usual bullshit of there goes Dankula again defending the rights of racists because they're absolute fucking morons that have completely missed the point of this video. Which was that if the government can come after you so hard to the point where they can literally blow the head off of a woman holding a baby and face fucking zero criminal repercussions, and there is no way to hold them to account just because they didn't like your beliefs or because you didn't want to do something for them, I don't know. I just see that as a pretty fucking serious problem. Don't go anywhere. You sit right there. I've got live shows coming up in London this December, and you can buy tickets to them down below and come to see me. I've got a small show at Comedy Unleashed, and then I've got 2 big shows later in the week. You can come to my shows if you buy tickets, and the link's down below. For the 4 women who watch this channel, you can buy them as an early Christmas present for your man friend or boy toy or whatever the hell you've got. I don't know what women do, but still, come to my show and I will tell funny jokes, and I promise I'll only be a little bit racist. Just a little bit racist. But anyway, come to my show. I want to see you all in person, so I can fight you.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.